questions on it, and I've added some extra things from last time. Remember, I always like to start with the venous return. So this is deoxygenated blood that's flowing back to the heart. So remember that venous blood or that deoxygenated blood is going to pass through the two large veins, which if you haven't seen, you'll see today. All right, guys, keep it down. Superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are the two main veins that drain into the heart. Remember, they drain into the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood is going to get pumped into the right ventricle. Along the way, it's going to pass through the right AV valve. So remember, most of the valves are pretty logically named. So the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the right AV valve or the right atrioventricular valve. Remember, it has a couple other names. The tricuspid valve is probably the most common other name for it. From the right ventricle now, it's going to pass through the pulmonic valve. It's going to go through the pulmonary trunk, which is the major outflow of the right ventricle. It's going to pass through the pulmonary arteries, and then the pulmonary arteries are going to break up in the lungs. Remember, this is one of the sort of things that we always think about arteries carrying oxygenated blood, but this is the one example where we actually have an artery that's carrying deoxygenated blood. Because remember, it's carrying the blood returned from the body from the right ventricle on its way to the lungs to be reoxygenated. And we'll sort of talk about it in a second, but any blood that's flowing away from the heart in a vessel is referred to as an artery. So that's why you see an artery carrying deoxygenated blood. But this is going to be the only example of that we'll see. So remember, the blood is going to flow into the lungs. It's going to get reoxygenated. Carbon dioxide will get cooled off. From there, the blood is going to get drained through the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins are going to drain the blood from the lungs into the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood will pass through the left AV valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's going to flow out into the aorta via the aortic valve. And from the aorta, it'll break up into the tissues of the body. The oxygen will get extracted, and we'll be back to venous return. Yeah?
What did you say about the arteries? You said they...
Oh, so I'm going to get to it in 1 second. About an artery versus a vein. So I'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah.
Can you kind of explain a little bit more? What do you mean? The RV will go to the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries?
So from the right ventricle, it's going to go into a structure known as the pulmonary trunk. So it's just a big tube coming out of the right ventricle. That pulmonary trunk is going to split into a left and right pulmonary artery. And so the left pulmonary artery will go to the left lung, the right pulmonary artery will go to the right lung, and from there they'll branch out to finer and finer structures. And when they're at their finest, smallest structure, the lungs will transport the oxygen into them.
The trunk and the arteries fall under the pulmonic valve.
Now the pulmonic valve is just this sort of gatekeeper that makes sure the blood is flowing in one direction. These are just large vessels that the blood is passing through from the right ventricle on its way to the lungs. It'll first pass through the pulmonary trunk, which is a single large vessel. That single large vessel will branch into two, which are going to be the two pulmonary arteries. And from there, they'll branch out into the circulation. But what we'll have is something, we'll have, so this is going to be the right ventricle. If we just think of this as a chamber. Coming out of it is going to be the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is going to divide into the two pulmonary arteries. So there'll be a left and a right. And each one of these arteries will branch out into smaller and smaller branches. Does that make sense? So just think of the pulmonary trunk as the large vessel that's coming out of the right ventricle. It's going to split into a left and right pulmonary artery. Each pulmonary artery will go to the left and to the right lung. And then all those arteries will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And when they're at their smallest, at the capillary stage, that's where they'll give up their carbon dioxide, they'll get recharged with oxygen, and then those blood vessels will get bigger and bigger and bigger. They'll form the pulmonary veins that are draining the blood from the lungs, which is now oxygenated. And then that freshly oxygenated blood is going to get transported into the left atrium.
You just want us to know the order of these chains?
Yeah, you should know roughly the order, and I mean, for most of these, you should know where the structure is in the live animal as well. Like, if you're doing veins tonight, you'll see the superior and the inferior vena cavas. We've talked about the chambers of the heart in the sheep. We've also talked about the valves already. You know, hopefully you guys know where the lungs and the heart are by now. Things like the aorta. So most of these structures you probably have already seen in one form or another. Does that make sense? So it boils down, you know, in its sort of most basic sense, is the right atrium to the right ventricle to the left atrium to the left ventricle. You just have to remember between the right ventricle and the left ventricle is we have this circuit for the lungs, and then between the left ventricle and the right atrium is sort of the circuit for the body where the blood's going out. And then, you know, like I said, it's once you know the chambers of the heart, it's fairly straightforward to figure out the valves that are separating them. You know, between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the right AV valve. Between the left ventricle and the left atrium is the left AV valve. Between the left ventricle and the aorta is the aortic valve, makes sense. And then between the right ventricle and the lungs is the pulmonic valve. And whenever you see that pulm term, that P-U-L-M, it's usually referring to the lungs in some capacity. Does that make sense? And all this is written down as well in your dissection guide. The one thing I was alluding to a second ago that maybe I should have started with first is just general circulation of blood through the body. That remember, blood is going to leave the heart as it's going out to the body through arteries. Arteries are always flowing away from the heart, which is what I was referring to earlier. So in general, or actually all the time, blood flowing away from the heart is always an artery. Most of the time that's oxygenated blood. Because the heart is a pumping station, its main function, in addition to pumping in blood out to the body, is to pump to the lungs where it can get recharged with oxygen. So most of the blood, or all of the blood that's leaving the heart, it's going away from the heart. Other than the pulmonary arteries, all the other arteries are going to contain oxygenated blood. Arteries are going to break down into smaller and smaller structures, referred to as arterioles, and then the smallest structure they become is the capillary. So at their smallest level, they're just a tiny blood vessel that's so narrow, only red blood cells can fit through single file. So it's only the width of an actual red blood cell. That's the point where the oxygen is going to get extracted by the tissues, CO2 is going to get absorbed into the blood, and then these smaller pieces of capillary will start coalescing again. They'll start combining to form larger and larger vessels, but now they'll be containing deoxygenated blood. So the smallest structures on the other side of a capillary are going to be venules, and then more venules will come together to form the veins, and then ultimately the veins in the form of the superior and the inferior vena cava are going to dump all of that unoxygenated or deoxygenated blood back into the heart circuit. So the veins are always carrying blood towards the heart, and arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. So that's hard and fast. That's a 100% rule. Arteries are always going away from the heart. Veins are always going towards the heart. Most of the time, 99% of the time, these arteries that are flowing away from the heart are containing oxygenated blood. And 99% of the time, the veins that are flowing towards the heart contain deoxygenated blood. Our one exception to the rule are these pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. So if we look at pulmonary arteries and veins, pulmonary arteries are flowing away from the heart, so they meet our definition of an artery, but they're actually containing deoxygenated blood. And then the pulmonary veins that are flowing back towards the heart are actually carrying oxygenated blood. So it's the one exception to the rule. So does that make sense? But sort of the heart of, no pun intended, of the circulation is you have the heart that recharges the blood, that leaves the heart in arteries. The arteries break up into smaller arterioles. The arterioles ultimately break up into capillaries or capillary bed, which are the smallest blood vessels we'll see. Once the oxygen is extracted, those vessels will start to combine with one another. They'll form larger structures referred to as venules. The venules will combine with other venules to form larger structures known as veins, and then those veins will take deoxygenated blood back to the heart again. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that, and then I wanted to throw one more thing at you that Dr. Mendelsberg mentions. which fit. So when we talk about sort of the regular circulation through the body, there's always one capillary bed, that you have arterial blood coming in, the arteries break up, the oxygen's extracted, the capillary bed closes down, and then all of that blood goes back to the heart. So there's only one capillary bed in this whole situation. On one side of it you have the arterial side, on the other side you have the vein side. So there's a couple instances in the body, we're only going to talk about one. We're going to talk about something called a portal system. The main center of the portal system is instead of having one capillary bed, so instead of one capillary bed with arterial blood on one side and venous blood on the other, we actually have two capillary beds now. It's the same general flow that you have oxygenated blood flowing, it breaks up into a capillary, and then there's venous blood. But what happens is we add the second capillary bed. So if we were just looking at this part of the circulation, you have arterial blood coming in, it breaks up, oxygen's extracted, venous blood is generated. Normally, what we've seen so far is this circuit would just sort of go this way. That we'd have this loop, our heart would be down here, we'd have one single capillary bed out in the tissues, and around it goes. But there's a couple situations where we actually will see a second capillary bed. And for the main goal of this, or the main reason why we see this in terms of the anatomy you guys are learning, is for the GI tract. So the GI tract, the things we're eating are constantly containing bacteria and viruses and toxins, and I know it sounds gross, but it's completely normal that we're constantly taking things into our body that potentially have infectious agents, like viruses and like bacteria. And if we simply had a single capillary bed, that if all the venous blood from our GI tract was simply dumped back into systemic circulation, it's very likely that we would let loose bacteria and different toxins and things like that directly into our bloodstream, which is obviously not a really good idea. So what will happen is, in the GI tract, it's just like any other tissue, in that arterial blood will come in, you'll have a capillary bed in the GI tract, and then venous blood will come out. The problem is, this venous blood is potentially contaminated with bacteria, with viruses, you name it. So what happens is, instead of just dumping this back into the heart to be recirculated through the body again, these veins are going to go to the liver. They go into the liver, and they actually open up into another capillary bed. So you basically have veins that are opening up into a second capillary bed. And the thing is, the function of these capillaries aren't to exchange oxygen, because this blood's already deoxygenated. So it doesn't really have anything to offer to the liver. It's really spent blood already. But what happens is, it gives the liver a chance to sort of filter through it. It's almost like a sieve in your kitchen. It'll go through this blood, and it'll suck out any bacteria, viruses, it'll detoxify any nasty agents or anything like that. And then again, you'll have these veins form on the other side of it as well. But now this blood should be clean coming out of it. And so we'll call this clean, and we'll call this dirty. So it's really just a way to filter the venous blood that is coming from the GI tract. And once the second capillary bed forms, what happens is there's veins in the liver, and those hepatic veins, which we refer to them, will then dump back into systemic circulation, because now this blood is clean. It's ready to go back to the heart, get reoxygenated through the lungs, and then go through a circuit again. So let me explain that one more time. Yeah. So previously we've talked about, and it's underneath this one. Shows very well. We talked about the normal flow through the heart, that the heart goes into an artery, the artery opens up into a capillary bed, oxygen's extracted, vein is formed on the other end of our capillary bed, and around we go. In the case, so this is sort of that case, that if we have the heart down here, the heart would pump to a capillary bed, we'd have oxygenated blood on one side, deoxygenated blood on the other side, the deoxygenated blood gets pumped to the heart, and around it goes. The problem is, in certain areas of the body, namely the GI tract, there's a lot of potential for the blood that's getting drained from those tissues to be contaminated. The GI tract is probably one of the dirtiest organs in our body, or the dirtiest tissues, in that all the foods that we eat have bacteria in them, usually not significant amounts. unless you get something like food poisoning, but there's potentially viruses and just all kinds of sort of nasty stuff that we don't really appreciate on a gross level. So all of this venous blood that's coming out of these capillary beds in the GI tract is potentially contaminated. So we sort of think of that as dirty blood. So this is dirty blood that also is deoxygenated. So it's sort of the bottom of the barrel in terms of our blood. So instead of taking that potentially contaminated blood and just dumping it back into systemic circulation, circulating it again through the body, what will happen is this second capillary bed will come together. This will be venous blood that now potentially has infectious agents in it. Those veins are going to go to the liver, and then in the liver they're actually going to open up into a second capillary bed. So on the second capillary bed, there's actually venous blood on both sides. So the blood comes in deoxygenated. There's nothing to extract, so there really isn't any oxygen extraction. There's really no CO2 addition. The main thing is this just acts like a filter now in the liver. And one of the main functions of the liver is to detoxify blood. And this is exactly how it does this because of this portal system. You take all the nasty contaminated blood from your GI tract, you open that up in a second capillary bed in the liver, and then what will happen is it'll sort of go in as dirty, come out as clean. It's still deoxygenated because it didn't have any oxygen coming into the system, so it's not going to get any oxygen coming out of it because the lungs aren't involved. But what happens is it gives the liver a chance to remove all of that bacteria. If there's any toxins that you may have consumed, hopefully the liver can detoxify that. So now this blood coming out of the second capillary bed, it's still venous blood, but now it's clean. Once it's clean, it's fair game to go back into the systemic circulation where it'll go to the heart and it goes round and round. So most of the tissues that we've talked about so far have a single capillary bed. You have arterioles on one side, veins on the other side. In the case of the portal system, what will happen is you actually have two capillary beds. One capillary bed will be somewhere in the GI tract, be it large intestine, small intestine, the stomach. All of those have or contribute to what's called the portal system. Their venous blood will then get pumped to the liver, where those vessels will open up into a second capillary bed that'll hopefully filter out any nasty stuff you may have eaten or picked up through your GI tract. And then that clean deoxygenated blood goes back into the systemic circulation. So what happens is we'll see if we can find it. Some of these cats it's easy, some of them are not. But if you follow all the veins coming out of the GI tract, what you're going to find is they don't go into the inferior or superior vena cava. What happens is right in the middle of the abdominal cavity, all those veins will come together, and there'll be this thick vein known as the portal system or the portal vein, and then that portal vein will go into the liver, and then it'll come out. The thing is, this portal vein, so in this case, sort of this segment of this would be the portal vein in the cat. The problem is with the latex that they inject into cats, it actually can't cross a capillary bed. So what they can do is they can inject on the arterial side, and they can inject on the venous side, but you won't see any blue latex in the portal system, because even if you come at the system from both directions, you have a capillary bed on either side. And so whereas in something like this, you can inject on the arterial side, you can inject on the venous side. Since there's only one capillary bed, you'll basically fill up all the vessels except for this portal vein, because like I said, the latex is just too large, the molecules are too large to cross these capillary beds. That being said, we can usually find it though. The easiest way is just to find the veins that are coming out of the small and large intestine, and you should find, like I said, instead of draining into the inferior or the superior vena cava, they'll drain into the smaller vein that's going to go right into the liver, and then we'll be back to our regular circulation again. Does that make sense? I know, it's one of those things you sort of have to take in and think about it. The book describes it, or Dr. Mendelsberg describes it. I think they also describe it in the Spiral Bound in the Marie Guide as well. But that's why I wanted to make sure I took the time to explain. The big thing is, you have two capillary beds instead of one capillary bed. The second capillary bed is just there to filter out any noxious sort of materials or infectious materials you may have picked up in your GI tract. That's really what it boils down to. Okay? Do you guys have any questions for me? Okay. Hearts are